When the European Reformation military forces arrived on the American continents, they were received well by the locals because their previous experience with people from across the Atlantic was a very good one. In response to the kindness of the locals, the reformators slaughtered most of the population without any mercy. And although most of the culture and social infrastructure of the Native Americans was simply trashed, destroyed at that time, people as such, they still had a high consciousness. Although the country or empire to which the Americas belonged, an empire that you will not hear even a word about in your so-called scientific history textbook, was destroyed as such, and there was no central organization anymore, still the people, being righteous at heart, preferred to die rather than adopting the ways of the invaders, who were clearly showing their real face of low-class murderers, criminals. This is an extremely interesting atlas, part of Encyclopedia Britannica, the most respected edition of its type in those times. Here they depict various continents with excellent accuracy. You can see even the tributes of the Amazon River are very accurately depicted, although it is extremely difficult to get there even nowadays and make an accurate map. I mean, if you do it on ground level. So they could send scouts out there in the heavily flooded areas of the Amazon, but what we see in North America, it says with big letters, parts undiscovered. What exactly could have stopped them to go over there? Was it the reed boats of the native Indians? I doubt that very much. What was stopping them was still some military forces left from the empire of the survivors. That's why they could not get access there still. A 16th century map by Giuliano Vespucci showing the double-headed eagle, the main symbol of the state symbol of the empire of the survivors over the Americas. This is a map of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, made by Cortés, who destroyed the city. But he made this map to show us how it was before he destroyed it. And curiously enough, he places that same double-headed eagle on the city while he is still depicting it before the destruction. Maps, artifacts, murals, and everything else that contains symbols that we are told are purely European or Asian, when they are found in America, we are always told, oh, this has been brought by the colonialists. And because they say it so often, it doesn't need verification anymore. Apparently, people have to just believe it. But why everything has to be necessarily brought by the colonialists when we have plenty of artifacts dating from older layers and cultures with allegedly European and Asian symbols? Actually, they're not European or Asian. They belong to that culture of the people who had still memories from the times when more advanced civilizations were on Earth, had some of their knowledge. And since the parasitic policy is to avoid even mentioning the existence of that culture, all its symbols, artifacts, etc. are put into some box to which they do not belong. That's why the main history is so often ridiculously inconsistent. So this is the flag of the Mi'kmaq Nation. So what they're telling me is that the Christian fanatics brought this symbol as well to America, and they put also the symbol of Islam, at least that's how it is labeled in the official history as well. No, they didn't. Actually, this symbol, this flag, has survived from the older times when the cross and the crescent, and also with a star that goes together with the crescent, when they were together, when all these religions were one and the same. If the Mi'kmaq nation had as a symbol any of these three symbols here like separately, then I could believe that they came up with this idea independently, or if it is across the conquistadors gave them that idea. But the chances to combine exactly these three symbols and to make it like their main coat of arms, and by pure chance that happens to be the main symbol also of the Empire of the Survivors, well, that's a little bit too unlikely to be true. An old photograph of Native American warrior with double-headed eagle. So, as we said, these symbols are all over both Americas, and always we are told they're colonial. But sometimes the truth transpires, because along with them in these churches with these symbols, we see inscriptions like this. This is with Cyrillic letters. So what, the Spanish conquistadors brought that as well? Or what about the antique statues found all over South America? Officially, they are also labeled as colonial, but these are clearly antique, what most people call Roman style statues. Look at the helmets, look at the spears. This is a Neptune, pagan god from the point of view of the missionaries and conquistadors. So did those absolutely fanatic missionaries who were burning people alive with their books because they were pagan, did they in their off time, in their free time, wear miniskirts, forget that they're Christians, and build statues of the pagan gods? It's not just Neptune who seems to be wearing a single vine leaf only. Also the ladies, they're barely dressed. There are plenty of aqueducts in America, the highest concentration being in Mexico. They're in no way different from the aqueducts that people call Roman in Europe. The looks is the same, the building style, the techniques used, absolutely everything. And as far as I understand, one of these aqueducts, found in the center of Mexico City, is directly built to feed with water an ancient native city. And yet we are told that all these aqueducts are colonial. What? Those people who came and murdered millions started such a large-scale construction. Unbelievable. All these photographs are only from America. No European aqueducts here on these photographs. So those murderers built them? Even if we assume that the colonialists didn't build them themselves, but taught the local people how to do it, still it is very suspicious, because these are very complex, actually engineering things. Look at the ants on the top. Those are people. This is huge. This requires lots of knowledge. and also experience. You don't just come up with such things, you don't start with such complex stuff. It makes much more sense to suggest that the aqueducts were built by the same culture in both America and Europe and Asia. Since they were always connected, of course, the knowledge of building aqueducts could have been easily transmitted as well. This doesn't mean that all aqueducts are pre-Columbian. Actually, the opposite. Most probably, the majority of them were built after the conquest. Don't forget what is the Reformation all about. It's a very bloody war in Europe and America, and actually worldwide, as we're gonna see in the future episodes. But all that the parasitic forces could do at this time is place their own people in government positions. The people, the common people, were still relatively free. They could also travel without restrictions, not like us nowadays. And even though the newly appointed governments all over the world during the Reformation period started gradually tightening the knot of tyranny amongst the citizens, it really seems that the process was much slower in those days. Like, for example, in the current moment, it's escalating very rapidly. The masses, the people, were still very much connected to their higher spirits. They couldn't be cheated easily to voluntarily surrender their freedom, like us, for example, few shallow lies on TV, and we go like sheep to vote for some rotten, corrupt potato politician, and after that we comfort ourselves. But we live in democracy, right? Because we choose our politicians, we vote for them, right? No, we only choose our prison superintendents, not the presidents. So, what did the masses do after the terrible Reformation nightmare? Still, with whatever freedom they had, they created something beautiful out of the ashes of their destroyed culture, and that is now very mistakenly labeled as new classical style. Actually, when we take into consideration the shifts in history, like for example the 1,000-year shift, when many events were artificially shifted with 1,000 years back in time, and few other shifts were there. When we look at this as well and all the other factors, it actually turns out that the new classical style did not appear out of some sort of strange sentiments, but it was a direct continuation of the antique style. There was no gap when people forgot how to build in antique style. This gap is an illusion because of this artificial 1,000 years. The new classical style was, so to say, the last flower to blossom on the tree of the culture of the survivors. Interesting house in South America. The wooden decoration is identical to that on the Russian traditional houses. Same in San Francisco. The gold that comes from each and every gold mine slightly differs in chemical composition from the others. And that's why, with the help of a chemical test, one can actually find out the gold mine from which the material for the given golden object came from. And so once somebody tested an antique Russian golden item, and the result was pretty unexpected. Actually, the object was made of Peruvian gold. So one more confirmation. In the period that we call antiquity, the people were not divided by the oceans, as the modern historians always present the picture to us. Probably it was just the opposite. They were connected by oceans. And another example, a relatively more recent, probably from New York. And what are these two Slavic figures doing over there in New York? Every detail of their outfit is precisely Slavic traditional, even in the small details. On the left, we have a Slavic monk, and on the right, a Slavic warrior. These are ancient Mayan figurines exhibited in the Museum of Toronto. The people that are depicted wear turbans. Yet one more proof for a connection with Asia. Now here on this photograph, not only we have the turban chap, but also his friend has got a snake on the forehead, exactly like the Egyptians. And a few more examples of unusual headwear amongst native Indians. And the people who are having those turban-like things on their heads are also sitting the way the Asians sit. And here we have even a photograph of a shaman, native shaman, wearing something like that. Native to the Americas, I mean. Not much of his face is visible, but I must say that the mustaches also look quite oriental, not only the turban. Large statues of the gods of antiquity dominated the main squares and the most important public places, not only in South America but also in North America. Officially, we are told that this was kind of part of the package called neoclassical style. Really, did people get out of their own minds to the extent that just out of architectural fashions they forgot even who are their own gods and started erecting gigantic statues of the gods of other people? I think that the most convincing reason for which nobody should believe even a single word from all the stories that they are telling us about the neoclassical style and the people who built in that way is the chain of events which brought about the demise of the neoclassical cities. The cities were not destroyed completely, but just enough so that the statues of the gods of goodness would be replaced with those of devils, and of course, most importantly, this was taking place not only on the city squares, but also in the hearts of the people. A couple of years ago, I started mentioning in various videos about strange things that the Russians are finding out on large territories of Siberia, namely cities buried under a couple of meters of mud, clay, and also forests that were completely devastated some 200 years ago, like young forests. The old trees were killed, all of them, 100%. And those territories are the size of a couple of big countries. We are not talking about a small regional thing, we're talking about something big. And then all of a sudden I started receiving so many messages from the viewers of the channel It turned out that this problem with the buried buildings, and again without a sensible explanation, and often without any explanation at all, I mean official explanation, so such buildings and cities are all over Europe and a lot of them in America as well. For example, this is a photograph of the Colosseum from the times when it was still buried. So many examples along these lines came from the West Balkans that I had to make a separate long video with all those examples. Now let's see some of the strange things that were happening to the people in America during the last few centuries. Now something dramatic took place on 25th of August 1814 in Washington, D.C. We don't even know what exactly happened because we only have official sources and those seem to be somewhat inconsistent. So the official story starts like this. The British were putting the city on fire and they didn't even notice that a terrific storm is brewing above them in the skies.
Well, of course, these people come from London. It's such a dry desert there, it hasn't rained in 700 years. Poor Brits, since they didn't know how a rain cloud looks like.
Here they're telling us the story. The Brits didn't have a slightest idea how bad the storms in DC can get. Well, of course, they don't have the slightest idea. Britain is on Venus and not on the Atlantic Ocean as DC.
A fierce storm was upon them and they didn't know what's happening. The British cannons were tossed by the winds.
I had a slight difficulty figuring this one out. It looked like to me this is a bit too heavy to be tossed by the wind. But of course, they meant that their toys, the toy cannons, were tossed away, not like the big military real cannons. Solid, huge buildings like this one were collapsing during that time, but they killed only a couple of Brits, of course. Everybody knows that they have 9 lives each, right?
The White House was buried in mud until the second floor.
And so was the rest of the city. Aha, now that I really believe, because this type of events, they leave entire cities buried under meters of mud and not the cultural layers as they're telling us what people didn't sweep the streets. They were every day instead carrying buckets with mud to bury their own homes. They must have been doing it if all the cities were buried in a peaceful way, as the mainstream history implies. And what a curious coincidence that this terrific storm was upon them exactly on the day of the battle. Strange. And in the future episodes, I'm gonna tell you about the battle in Moscow, where the same thing happened just on the day of the battle. And again, the stories of the various disasters that happened are quite suspicious. And the latest thing that was discovered about that particular battle in Moscow was, by the way, that they even lied to us about who were the parties fighting the battle and the entire war, as a matter of fact. So, were the enemies of the human race capable of weather manipulation? Most definitely, we hear lots of stories along those lines in the legends of the indigenous people from all over the world. And not only the enemies of the human race, also the people themselves always knew how to do it in the past. They did it more efficiently with magic. For example, the story of Milarepa, the Tibetan magician who later on became a saint. But people did it with magic at the times when they had more personal freedom than now. Now we can do it as well. with the help of towers, which spit out rain clouds, and God knows what else they can spit out as well. In the description, you can find the link to a video showing one of those towers. So we can do it now as well, but the technology has changed. Because if they were training people to do it as before, then these humans may decide to use it humanely. But when it is done by machines, then it becomes relatively easy to use it inhumanely. And now let's see the next event, the mainstream description of which really leaves a lot to be desired.
The fire of Peshtido left a really nuclear-scale devastation behind itself.
Fire tornadoes killed thousands.
And jumped over bodies of water. People jumped into lakes to save themselves and were boiled alive there.
Official explanation: severe droughts.
How can that throw fire tornadoes that tossed away heavy trains hundreds of meters away?
Even the very fact that they write and publish such obviously nonsense explanations and do it with great confidence, as if there is nothing wrong with what they're saying, that by itself is very, very suspicious.
Ah yes, if they were saying this is really strange, we have no clue, then I would respect them. And on the very same day, the Great Fire of Chicago occurred, leaving much of the city devastated.
And then on that very same day is reported that numerous fires endangered towns across the state. What does it mean they were endangering towns? It means to me there were smaller fires in various other towns as well on the same day. This so-called coincidence, combined with many unusual phenomena reported by eyewitnesses, has led some to conclude that the extraordinary force, one not of the earth, was a more likely arson than either a misbehaving cow or a regional drought. And what is exactly this unusual phenomenon that they mention? Pitiless rains of fire and sand, great balls of fire unrolling, igniting entire streets at once. And in a relatively short period of time, many American cities were devastated by such fires. Of course, great fires can be just caused by bad luck, human mistakes, everyday mistakes. That is possible. But when we see just too many of them, all of a sudden, one starts wondering, well, wait a minute, people are using fire since thousands of years. How come exactly in America, at that particular time period, the people became so inattentive that they allowed all these fires to spread, to start, and always the firefighters couldn't help enough.
Or the New England's Black Day. Almost through the full day it was pitch dark as if it is midnight, and people had no clue what's happening. Now they blame it on some sort of forest fires. Yes, after decades, when the people who knew there were no fires are all gone. I mean, when you have such dense smoke from fires,
one would be, of course, able to see smoke and most probably even smell it.
Now, some say that even the US Capitol building is built on a much older and stronger base. They say that the time when it was officially constructed, in reality, it was only modified and expanded. I don't know if that's true, but the important point is that there were additions later on. And regardless of how much older is the older part, the interesting thing is that the additions constantly need a repair, while the older parts are of much better quality, they're much stronger. Very strange in this age where we're supposedly evolving technologically. This is the Washington Monument, and it appears to be built actually on an older megalithic basis, eroded one. On this second photograph, you can see that the material is quite different, the new one and the older one. Probably the eroded parts needed to be reinforced. Well, after seeing this, I no longer ask myself where did the megalithic stones appear on Brighton Beach. Well, they were the rest of the megalithic architecture, because it's not that just one monument and that's the full civilization and that's everything. Of course, there is more to it.
Some of the most beautiful buildings in New York, like the Penn Station, were simply torn down, demolished.
Probably somebody simply could not bear the sight of the magnificent angels. They had to be substituted with this type of fellows.
So while Russian researchers were trying to figure out the details of a great flood in St. Petersburg, because, by the way, the full official history of the city doesn't make much sense as well, it turned out the new classical city of St. Petersburg was also buried under mud, but the actual event was not even local. Exactly at that time, the same was reported in Sweden, France, and even San Francisco, where the winds would carry away the roofs of the houses. That very same storm landed on the shores of England as well, and over there it was called the Great Gale of 1824. In the same way as they avoid giving even a name to the culture, the civilization of the survivors, and instead of that, they call them with different names in different countries to make them look like local people. In the same way, the global events which contributed to the destruction of this culture in its later stages, they are also called with different names in different lands to make them look unrelated. But severe weather was only part of the full story. All this story with the falling mud and sand from the skies, where did it come from? For example, in Sicily, they describe a rain of sand, and the sand looked so strange that they describe it as unearthly. And in addition to clay and sand raining from the skies, this period, some 200 years ago, when the new classical cities were buried, was also rich in unusual activity in the skies, so to say. For a relatively short period of time, people saw lots of fireballs. They called them comets in the skies. People saw strange things. We don't see such things now. Here is just one of them. Something like northern lights, but all over Europe. Just after sunset, unusual strong glow in the skies. Then it looks reddish, as if there is a great fire somewhere. But of course, observing balls of fire in the skies and having rainfall of mud and clay and all kinds of substances which come from faraway parts of the planet, that's something that occurs naturally. So maybe some of you wonder why is she trying to mix completely natural events with other disasters like the fire of Peshibo. That is a really suspicious one. So the answer is that first of all, if a given phenomena can be natural, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is always completely natural. Like, for example, hurricanes. Mother Nature is perfectly capable of creating such, and so are the people. So when we have a hurricane, it is not sure what was the origin of it. And even if a given hurricane was artificially created, still the hurricane as such remains a natural phenomena. So at the end, we arrive where our forefathers used to be long time ago, in a world without a clear boundary of what is natural and what is not. The modern history books call them dumb because they saw intelligent beings pulling the strings behind certain natural events, but in reality, we are the dumb ones. Because we allow our children to be taught such nonsense at school, while everybody can see how the towers spit out clouds and create the weather. And there is a second point in answer to the question, why do I mix suspicious events with naturally looking ones? Well, there seem to be too many suspiciously looking circumstances about these mud rains and strange fires from the skies causing destruction. What are they? Well, first of all, the entire civilization of the ancient Egyptians, which was living in a tropical climate, was destroyed, buried under sands. In some parts, they were like completely covered, not just 1 or 2 meters, but the entire villages were buried under many meters of sand. So, first of all, it is suspicious that it happened instantly. Yeah, people were buried during their household chores. That is proven by excavations. And second of all, it is very suspicious that this topic is like a taboo. They don't talk about these things much in the mainstream history. Instead, they're uh, talking general things like Sahara was green millions of years ago. Another suspicious point are ancient sites, like, for example, the Cholula pyramid in the previous episodes, and other, like a couple of fortresses in Asia. They are definitely buried with mud, and it's again lots of mud. It's not something that you bring manually. And also, it seems, I'm only saying it seems, I have not seen confirmations, but this seems to be selective, like only for the site. Now, that is extremely suspicious. That is the most suspicious of all. And this is something that can be very easily checked, like also with the neoclassical cities. If it is only them buried under mud and the areas, the fields around are not, then we are surely talking about something natural but not so natural. And then the two most suspicious things are the fact that in main history it is not even discussed who buried the neoclassical cities with mud. And the other most suspicious thing is what happened during this battle with Napoleon in Moscow, which I'll review in detail in the subsequent episodes of this documentary. And that one is a clear proof that those who fabricate the lies about our history don't hesitate to disguise acts of arson as natural events. So I've been continuously mentioning a war on humanity, a war on the human race. Why all that? Why? To turn us from normal people to this. remotely controlled zombies wearing symbols of the devil from top to bottom. And that's why the most important part of this war is not destroying our houses, but our belief system. Long time ago, I saw a documentary where a very old native Hopi woman was telling how her tribe was forced to abandon the way of life that they had learned from their forefathers. Men with weapons arrived. They encountered a tribe which was far more superior to them in much higher consciousness. They lived peacefully, they had well organized society, they lived noble and righteous lives, and this was reflected also in their health. They easily lived up to 120 years, and they would have the hair, the teeth, the looks, and vitality of young men, even when they were very old, for our standards at least. Now, the men with weapons who arrived had the agenda to force two new things on the Hopi, peaceful Hopi people, and that was a new belief system and poisons. They called them new advanced medicines. The Hopis, who were of a weaker spirit, when they saw the cruel men with weapons, they just surrendered and accepted everything out of fear. Those of stronger spirit were hesitant and refused. They were threatened, beaten, raped, tortured until they accept. Those who didn't accept even after such kind invitations were killed. So all the Hopis who remained alive had accepted the new belief and the new poisons. The old woman who was narrating, she clearly remembers how these people, within one single generation, after accepting the new beliefs and the poisons, lost their vigor, vitality, and they started aging quickly like the men with weapons who visited them. That's us, by the way. And it is not by chance that the system called, misleadingly called, system for health care is always compulsory. And if you read the history of the medical so-called science, you will be left with the general impression that the various type of cure were invented to serve the people, to make them feel better, yeah? To recover from sicknesses, and everything evolved gradually, and as people would discover a certain cure, they would implement it. But sadly, this is true for a very small portion of the modern medical procedures, because there are indeed some which help people recover. Not many of them, but there are such as well. And the rest of the procedures sadly belong to the malevolent practices as those that were forced on the Hopis. And I think there is a very important lesson that we can learn from this story of the Hopis. Their lives were ruined within one single generation after accepting the toxic beliefs and substances. That means also that the reverse process can be that fast as well. If we stop poisoning ourselves with modern chemicals and revert our belief system to that of our forefathers, who lived in accordance with the instructions left by the benevolent spirits, the creators of the universe and the human race in particular, then our bodies will also change very quickly, and so will the environment around.
tadi kene kene apa